Today on the Perception in Action podcast, revisiting the distinction between habit and skill. How can perceptual motor control be fast enough to account for the speeds in most sports, yet at the same time be adaptable to changing constraints? Does this require some kind of mental representation and executive control? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and/or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I want to revisit a topic I covered a few times on the podcast before, in particular in episodes like 109 and 326, the conflict between being fast on the one hand and adaptable on the other. In skill research, we have believed for a long time that the fast actions involved in most sports require some sort of mindlessness. That is, responses that are automatic, habitual, or reflexive, that once started can run on their own without any type of attention or cognitive control. Using feedback to control movements in the moment seems to be just too slow. This is reflected in some of the quotes we see from athletes and coaches. For UCLA basketball coach John Wooden, the importance of repetition until automaticity cannot be overstated. Norman Peale emphasized that, quote, repetition of the same thought of physical action develops into a habit which, repeated frequently enough, becomes an automatic reflex, unquote. For Celtics player Bill Sharman, it's a game of habit or repetition. It's a reflex. The game is so quick you don't have time to think. Or from Papineau, quote, there is no room for real-time conscious decision in batting. Batting is automatic, not under conscious control. There's no time to think once the ball has been released. You can only react, end quote. But these concepts do not seem to allow for the flexibility and adaptability that is also required in sports. If the constraints an athlete faces are always changing, how can these pre-packaged and pre-planned habits handle these? These issues were recently discussed in a very interesting paper by Segundo Orton and Horacio Scabino. The authors begin by nicely laying out the problem. Quote, a mark of intelligent skilled action is adaptive flexibility. In order to achieve their goals, expert agents, for example athletes, must be able to control their actions, responding in an appropriate manner to the demands and contingencies of the situation. The problem is to explain how such adaptive flexibility is possible, end quote. And quote, if we can agree that there's probably no time for conscious planning and deliberation in situations that require rapid and coordinated responses, it is not clear how an action can be mindlessly automatic and intelligent at the same time. In other words, it is not clear how an agent can exert control over her actions, adjusting it in a flexible, context-sensitive way if she is performing with little or no attention to what she is doing, end quote. The typical way this problem has been addressed is by bringing top-down cognitive control back into the equation. That is, assuming that skilled behavior is not fully autonomous, but rather always involves some conscious explicit control. So kind of a middle ground between full conscious processing and automaticity. To quote the paper, according to these middle ground views, skilled actions are neither mindful, based on conscious reflection, nor mindless, purely reactive and automatic, but mind-dead, meaning that the skilled performer has some form of cognitive control over them. However, because these authors assume that any action that is not blindly automatic or mechanical must be the result of some representational cognitive process, their proposed explanation for skilled performance takes for granted that such control over actions depends on the existence of top-down representational processes." End quote. As this quote highlights, it's been assumed that the only way out of this problem of being both fast and flexible is through the use of executive control and mental representation. The authors begin the main part of their paper giving a nice review of automaticity. As they discuss, the role of conscious cognitive control in expert-level performance has really been limited to planning the movement and setting its parameters. After it starts, it runs off automatically in a reflex-like fashion. Critically, choosing the right action to execute relies on vast memory stores of previous situations and mental models to predict outcomes. To quote the paper, "The expert has built a rich repertoire of ready-made action patterns, so that after responding to hundreds of thousands of specific cases, the expert in a new situation spontaneously does something similar to what has previously worked, and lo and behold, it usually works." End quote. The fundamental problems with this, of course, are that adaptability would seem to require an impossibly large number of situations accumulated in memory and does not allow for any type of in-the-moment online adjustments. Quote, "In fact, it is reasonable to think that it is the capacity to continuously modify, adjust, and revise the current performance in light of emerging task goals and unexpected contingencies that constitutes the mark of intelligent action, and what most notably sets experts and novices apart. If skilled actions are automatically triggered by particular environmental cues and unfold without the agent's awareness, then they cannot be controlled. It follows from this that an agent who acts in a purely automatic way would come close to the zero intelligent agent. Bluntly put, if mastering a skill involves nurturing adaptive flexibility, then agents cannot let their reflexes run on their own." End quote. This is certainly consistent with my research on baseball batting, where I've seen that functional variability in the swing and motor synergies are the hallmarks of expertise. As I mentioned before, the typical solution to these problems has been to bring explicit cognitive control back into the story. An example of this can be seen in the mesh theory proposed by Christensen and colleagues, which I discussed a little bit back in episode 73 when looking at theories of choking under pressure. The central idea in mesh theory is that becoming skillful does not involve the removal of cognitive control, the progression from controlled to automatic processing first proposed by Fitz and Posner's model. Intentional control, processing, and interpretation are not eliminated at the expert level. Instead, in mesh theory, these structures become more well-organized and efficient so that less cognitive effort is required. Cognitive and automatic processes thus operate together in an intimately meshed arrangement, with cognitive control typically focused on strategic task features and automatic control responsible for implementation. Inherent in theories like mesh is the assumption that adaptability and flexibility in movement is a representation-hungry problem. That is, the only way we can account for intelligent adaptation is through representation and cognitive processes. This view was also notably expressed by Anders Ericsson, who argued that, quote, "Expert performers counteract automaticity by developing increasingly complex mental representations to attain higher levels of control over their performance." End quote. In the final section of the paper, the authors present their main argument that skillful, adaptive, intelligent behavior does not require representation. To quote the authors, "We argue, however, that the arguments for representationalism in skilled motor behavior are based on an unjustified assumption according to which if an action is not blindly automatic, it must be caused by some representational cognitive processes. In our view, cognitive control upon action does not necessarily require conscious propositional thought. Instead, we agree that there's a rich, underexplored space between mindful control and mindless automaticity. Following them, we call this in-between space minded." Unquote. To build their argument, the authors review the basic ideas of direct perception and information movement coupling I've discussed many times on the podcast. They emphasize Gibson's notion of specificity, the idea that the ambient energy array picked up by our perceptual systems is specific to the layout of surfaces in our environment and the opportunities for actions they afford. This in turn removes the need for representational interpretation of ambiguous or impoverished cues that is proposed in traditional theories of perception. By the way, if you want to learn more about the ideas of specificity and Gibson's ambient optic array, please check out the video I recently posted on my YouTube channel. Link in the show notes. To quote the authors, specificity implies that to perceive an affordance, the observer must modulate her attention, selecting or picking up the informational variables that are relevant for the goal she aims to achieve. Moreover, perceptual acts often involve more than shifting our attentional focus. They require skillfully exploring and manipulating the environment in order to generate the appropriate information. Both kinds of exploratory activity are under the control of the agent and are necessary in order to perceive the affordance. Therefore, even if affordances were shown to invite, solicit, or attract action in any way, this would not imply that the whole perception-action process is passive." End quote. But if perception action is goal-oriented, does that not require the assumption that goals are represented in the agent's mind and influenced in a top-down fashion, perception, and action? To counter this, the authors appeal to the idea that goals are self-organized, a concept I talked about in detail in episode 335 when looking at skilled intentionality. Another way to think of this is that the decisions and goals emerge as part of the whole process of perception action, rather than preceding the control of action in a linear fashion. Finally, the authors discuss the possible role of habits in this approach. For this, they appeal to a very different view of habits, first proposed by Dewey. Quote, "It is well recognized that a fundamental part of skill training consists of turning specific perception action cycles into habits. Broadly speaking, we understand habits as task-related dispositional perceptual motor sequences that are executed with less cognitive effort than other perception action cycles. Once the expert has incorporated these habits, she can respond and adapt to the environment in a more efficient way than novices." End quote. Rather than adopt a traditional view of a habit as being a rigid, automatic routine, the authors adopt a more self-organization embodied conception. Quote, "Series of perception action cycles, acts in the vocabulary of Dewey, become integrated as habits when one cycle leads to the next in the form of a tendency or disposition." End quote. Framing Dewey's idea in the context of ecological psychology, the authors propose that some habits consist of exploratory patterns that allow the actor to detect informational variables. Thus, perceptual learning consists of developing efficient habits of exploration that allows the performer to detect specific informational variables better than novices. This filtering function of habits proposed by Dewey fits very well with the idea of the education of attention. By turning these more refined exploratory patterns into habits, experts can detect the relevant information with less effort than novices. Exploratory habits promote intelligent behavior by constraining the range of possible actions at the level of perception. As an example of linking perception action cycles, the authors use the act of returning to the middle of the court after each shot in squash. Initially, a novice might need to consciously remind themselves to return to the middle without being sensitive to other information. But, quote, "With practice, the squash player can incorporate this act into her behavioral repertoire in the form of a habit. Linking this returning act to each executed stroke in the form of a habit or dispositional sequence reduces the need for conscious attention to this specific activity. Crucially, this frees the player's attentional focus to perceive other relevant affordances of the situation, namely the position of the opponent in the field, the presence of a gap that affords scoring, etc." End quote. Thus, we have intelligent habits. Instead of being stereotyped and inflexible, they are context-sensitive and adaptive. Quote, "A way to preclude habits from becoming mechanical drills, keeping them under control, is paying conscious attention to the affordances of the environment. It is because the agent is not acting on autopilot, but constantly searching for new information for affordances that she can control her behavior, adapting previously learned habits to the new particular circumstances. For instance, if the squash player realizes that her opponent has the tendency of sending the ball to the right side of the field, she will run to the side after each stroke instead of running back to the center. This is the opposite of letting a previously acquired reflex run on its own, but it does not require that the agent stops and thinks. Rather, the perception of a new affordance, the possibility of scoring more points when she is in the right part of the field, suffices for the expert to adapt her habitual playing style to the here and now." End quote. The authors sum up their view nicely. Quote, "We believe that control is achieved when habits are complemented by the agent's conscious attention to the affordances of the environment. It is not mental representations, but the direct perception of affordances what anchors habits to the world, precluding them from becoming rote mechanical drills and making skilled motor performance possible." End quote. So overall, I think this is a really interesting paper that I encourage you to have a look at in more detail. I think it nicely connects with the ideas of skilled intentionality, which I discussed back in episode 335. Creating information control laws that are guided by affordance perception allows for the fast and intelligent responses we see so often in sports. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.